Underneath Pioneer Square in Seattle, there is another city, not a metaphor, a literal city. Storefronts, sidewalks, utility corridors sealed beneath the surface you walk on. The original Seattle wasn't destroyed in the Great Fire of 1889. It was buried. The city raised its streets by 12 to 32 feet and built a new city on top of the old one. But the regrading wasn't a coordinated public works project. It was done block by block, building by building, owner by owner. In 1895, a pedestrian stepping off a streetcar in Pioneer Square crossed a wooden plank bridge suspended 20 feet above the original sidewalk below. Businesses were still operating down there, accessed by ladders through trapdoors, for years after 1889. This is not a charming quirk of local history. It is physical evidence of a city that handed its infrastructure to private landowners and never asked for it back. On June 6, 1889, a cabinet maker's glue pot boiled over in a shop on Front Street near Madison. The fire that followed burned for 18 hours. By the time it stopped, 25 city blocks were gone. Seattle's entire commercial district had been reduced to ash and exposed foundations. The city rebuilt in less than a year. That speed alone is extraordinary. But the word rebuilt hides what actually happened, because the city that rose in 1890 and 1891 was not placed on the same ground as the city that burned. The streets were raised, the grade was lifted, and the old city, its sidewalks, its foundations, its gas lines and alley walls, was not demolished. It was submerged. Today, approximately 21 blocks of subterranean corridor run beneath Pioneer Square. Structural surveys conducted in the 1990s found original brick storefronts intact. They found gas pipe stubs still threaded into walls. They found wood plank sidewalks, the kind pedestrians walked in 1888, still in place more than a century later. Most people who hear this assume the fire created the underground. It didn't. Many buildings that burned were simply rebuilt above the original grade, leaving their old ground floors and sometimes their entire first stories sealed below the new street level. Others that weren't badly damaged by the fire found themselves gradually lowered into the earth as the street surface around them climbed higher. The visible Seattle, the one above you, was constructed on top of a ghost infrastructure that nobody removed. And that choice, or rather, the total absence of any unified choice at all, was not an accident of fire. It was a product of how Seattle decided to govern itself after one. The question is, why the streets needed to be raised in the first place? And the answer goes back to where Seattle was built. The original city sat on a tidal mudflat at the southern end of Elliott Bay. Street level was only a few feet above high tide. The sewage system relied on gravity to drain into the bay, but at high tide, the water table rose above the pipe outlets. The sewage didn't drain. It backed up into basements, into streets, into the mud under the boardwalks. Every day, twice a day, depending on the tides. This was not a secret. It was the defining civic embarrassment of early Seattle. And after the fire created a clean slate, the city saw the opportunity to fix it permanently. The engineer tasked with the problem was Reginald H. Thompson, hired as Seattle's city engineer in 1892. Thompson's plan was simple in concept and massive in scale. Raise the street grid high enough to make gravity functional again. The method was hydraulic regrading, powerful water cannons pointed at the surrounding hills, washing the earth downhill into the tidal flats. The Denny regrade, begun in 1898, eventually moved 5.8 million cubic yards of earth across 30 years. The hills were literally washed away, but Thompson's street raising moved faster than property owners could respond. Streets were elevated before every building on those streets was rebuilt at the new grade. So as the new surface climbed, existing structures found their ground floors, and in some cases, their entire first stories, descending below the new sidewalk level. What people assume is that the fire created the underground. It didn't. The regrading created it. The fire just gave the city the reason to regrade. By the 1960s, Seattle had largely forgotten what was underneath Pioneer Square. The neighborhood was deteriorating. The above-ground buildings were aging and largely vacant, and the city's urban planners, armed with the same post-war clearance logic reshaping American cities from Detroit to San Francisco, had a solution: demolish it. Parking lots, highway ramps, progress. A 1962 city planning proposal targeted Pioneer Square for full clearance. The old low-rise brick buildings were classified as blight. The neighborhood's history, including whatever existed beneath it, was treated as an obstacle to modernity, not as evidence of anything worth examining. That is when Bill Speidel started paying attention. Speidel was a Seattle Times columnist, a local character, a man with the journalist's habit of following inconvenient questions past the point where most people stop. He had heard stories about what was under Pioneer Square. He started going down into it. What he found wasn't just architectural curiosity, it was a record of decisions made by specific men for specific financial reasons in a specific window of time when the city had been too disorganized or too indifferent to manage its own transition. In 1965, Speidel began running guided tours through the subterranean corridors below Pioneer Square. He charged admission. He told the story of the regrading, and he framed it not as charming local history, but as documented institutional failure with identifiable beneficiaries. His 1967 book, Sons of the Prophets, named them: Arthur Denny, Henry Yesler, John Leary. These were the dominant landowners of post-fire Seattle, and Speidel argued, chapter by chapter, that decisions about what to regrade, where to raise the streets, and how quickly to proceed had been shaped by whose property stood to gain most from rapid action. The men with the most land at the new grade level had the most incentive to push for speed. Those who moved slowly found their buildings becoming cellars. Speidel's tours made the underground famous. His book made it political, and his campaign, combining public access to the underground with a documented argument about who had profited from building it, led directly to Pioneer Square being named Seattle's first historic district in 1970. He didn't save a neighborhood out of sentiment. He used a physical space to prove a structural argument. Here is the part that gets quietly omitted from most accounts of Seattle's underground. The regrading of Pioneer Square was not a unified public works project. Thompson had the authority to set the new street grades, but the actual work of raising individual blocks, and, critically, the timing of that work, was left entirely to property owners. Seattle's city ordinances in the 1890s announced new grade levels, but imposed no enforceable deadline for compliance. If your building was still standing at the old grade and the new street was going up around it, the city did not compel you to rebuild. It noted the new grade. It moved on. So what happened was this: some owners rebuilt immediately. They put up new buildings at the new grade level by 1891 or 1892 and captured the rising property values that came with a functioning street grid. Others moved slowly, for reasons of capital, legal dispute, or inertia. Their structures, still standing at the original grade, found themselves surrounded by a rising streetscape they had not yet matched. The city's response to this mismatch was not to wait. It was to build a new sidewalk over the old one. The new sidewalk was a wooden trestle, a raised boardwalk on supports at the new grade, constructed directly above the original sidewalk, which remained in place below. For years, in some blocks for close to a decade, the pedestrian experience in Pioneer Square involved crossing a series of plank bridges over operating storefronts below. You reach those lower-level businesses by ladder through a trapdoor in the trestle floor. The glass prisms visible in Pioneer Square pavement today, hexagonal lenses set into the boards, were installed in those wooden trestles to push natural light down into the underground storefronts. They were a practical measure, not a design detail. The underground wasn't dark and sealed. It was still a working environment, lit from above by glass tiles, ventilated by whatever air moved through the open gaps. The utilities followed the same fragmented logic. Gas service, water connections, and early electrical lines were extended to buildings as individual owners rebuilt, not on any coordinated public schedule, which meant the underground was not a decommissioned space. It was a live, poorly mapped, patchwork environment of occupied buildings at various stages of abandonment, some functional, some collapsing, all connected by a subterranean corridor network that no single city agency had surveyed or controlled. The city raised the street. It did not manage the transition. It built a new sidewalk on top of the old one, handed responsibility to individual owners, and moved on. That is not an engineering failure. That is a governance failure. And it is the direct cause of everything that followed. They knew. By 1895, Seattle's city health inspectors had identified the Pioneer Square underground corridors as a public health concern. The primary issue was rats. The subterranean network, interconnected, largely unsealed, spanning multiple city blocks, provided an uninterrupted habitat that was impossible to monitor and nearly impossible to ventilate. The 1895 health reports described the corridors as a structural public nuisance. The recommendation was action. The action taken was minimal. In 1907, Seattle experienced a genuine bubonic plague scare. The city's response included inspections of the Pioneer Square underground. Officials recommended sealing or demolishing the accessible subterranean sections. Those recommendations were implemented the only way Seattle had ever implemented anything in this neighborhood, block by block, following property ownership lines, with each owner responsible for their own portion. There was no unified seal. There was no comprehensive removal plan. The underground was addressed the same way it had been created, piecemeal, privately, without coordination. Thompson's own engineering assessments from the 1890s had flagged the risks of the transitional period. His reports identified the years of mixed-grade development, when new-grade buildings stood next to old-grade buildings connected by trestles, as a window of inadequate ventilation, structural inconsistency, and sanitary hazard. The city proceeded through that window anyway, on the grounds that the transition would eventually complete itself. It did not. The underground was not officially mapped as a complete system until the 1960s, when Speidel's tour operation required a liability assessment before he could take paying customers below ground. Before that, the city's understanding of the subterranean footprint was fragmented, divided along the same property lines that had created the problem in the first place. No comprehensive map, no unified maintenance record, no single department responsible for it. Through the 1950s, urban renewal proposals repeatedly targeted Pioneer Square for clearance. Each one stalled. Demolition was expensive. The legal complexity of acting across dozens of private property lines was enormous. The political will fluctuated. And by the time Speidel's tours made the underground a public attraction in the late 1960s, the available political tool had shifted entirely, from demolition to preservation. The city had spent 70 years treating the underground as a private property liability problem rather than a public infrastructure emergency. And by the time a solution became politically viable, the only solution on the table was the one that froze the problem in place. In 1970, Pioneer Square was designated Seattle's first historic district. The designation stopped the demolition. It stabilized the above-ground brick buildings. It gave Speidel's tours official standing and eventually made the underground one of the city's most visited attractions. The city that had spent decades trying to erase the subterranean problem was now selling tickets to it. This looked like resolution. It was not. Historic designation protected the buildings. It also protected the conditions underneath them. The structural questions that had never been fully resolved, including differential settlement risk from loosely consolidated fill, Unsound sections in the deeper corridors and voids left by collapsed portions were now housed inside a protected historic district. You couldn't demolish them, but there was no funding for comprehensive stabilization either. Several sections of the underground were walled off in the 1970s after structural assessments found them too unstable for tours. They have remained walled off since. The glass sidewalk prisms offer a small, precise example of how this management works in practice. The city had installed those prisms in the 1890s as a functional measure, light sources for the underground storefronts still in active use. As the underground was progressively sealed across the early 20th century, the city began quietly removing the prisms, not to restore or maintain the underground, but specifically to reduce liability. The prisms were a city-owned feature, creating city-level exposure. Removing them was cheaper than addressing what was below them. Then, in February 2001, the Nisqually earthquake struck at a magnitude of 6.8. Pioneer Square suffered some of the heaviest structural damage in the city. Post-earthquake engineering assessments confirmed why the hydraulic fill Thompson had washed down from the surrounding hills in the 1890s behaved exactly as liquefaction models predict it should. During sustained seismic shaking, loose, unconsolidated fill amplifies ground motion rather than dampening it. The buried voids, the differential fill composition, and the century-old trestle remnants created precisely the kind of uneven foundation behavior that would not have existed if the old city had been properly removed and the fill properly consolidated. 100 years after Thompson completed his regrading, the material he used to solve the sewage problem was still shaping the physical consequences for everyone living above it. If you take the underground tour today, you walk through corridors of original brick, past doorways opening onto rooms sealed since the 1910s, past iron fixtures and remnant gas fittings that have been in place since before the telephone was common in Seattle households. The guides describe it as an archaeological experience, a time capsule, a hidden world. It is those things. It is also something else. Every brick in that corridor is there because Seattle had no legal mechanism to compel property owners to rebuild at the same speed as its own street raising project. Every intact doorway is a record of a transition that was announced but never managed. Every sealed corridor section is the result of a liability problem addressed the cheapest available way, one block at a time, across more than a century. Reginald Thompson solved the sewage problem. He raised the streets, washed the hills down, and gave Seattle a functional grade. That was genuine engineering, and it worked. What it didn't fix was the governance problem. The question of who was responsible for completing the transition, for removing the old infrastructure, consolidating the fill, mapping the underground, and maintaining it, was never answered. It was distributed outward to private property owners, and then forgotten. No agency held it. No ordinance enforced it. No budget funded it. The underground is still there, not because the fire was too big, or because the regrading was too ambitious, or because Thompson's plan was flawed. It is still there because a city made a series of decisions about how to regrade its own streets, and then declined to manage the consequences of those decisions as a public responsibility. It classified the problem as private. It watched the private solution fail. It tried to clear the result with urban renewal. That failed too. And then it ran out of options, except one. Seattle didn't build on top of a dead city. It built on top of a problem. It never finished solving, and then charged admission to look at it.